This lecture is on American colonization. I'm going to use a prayer from a Puritan woman and poet named Anne Bradstreet. She was an immigrant to Massachusetts. What shall I render to my God for all his bounty showed to me, even for his mercies and his rod, where pity most of all I see? My heart I wholly give to thee, O make it fruitful, faithful Lord. My life shall dedicated be to praise in thought, in deed, in word. Amen. So we've already talked a lot about Portuguese and Spanish colonization, but at the end of the 1500s, and especially in the early 1600s, in large part due to rivalry with Spain, England got involved in colonization. Other countries did as well, including France and the Netherlands. So on this map, you can see Spain is down here having colonized Florida. This is the oldest colonized part of the eastern seaboard of what becomes the United States. Up here in green, you have New France, the areas the French were colonizing. Here in pink, you have what the Dutch were colonizing, which becomes the beginnings of what is today New York. And then the yellow are the areas colonized by the English. Now, there were two main models, competing models, if you will, of English colonization, and each of which Christianity played out differently. On the one hand, you have the Puritan colonies up here in the north. On the other hand, you have the more Anglican colonies down here in the south. Now, in the middle, there was a hodgepodge of different things going on, and we're not going to talk about that today. We're just going to focus on these two more starkly competing models of the Puritans and the Anglicans. We'll begin with Virginia in the south. As I mentioned, by the 1600s, there was a lot of pressure in England to establish a colonial presence in America to rival that of Spain and Catholicism. As it was sometimes put, the English needed to raise a bulwark for the gospel against Spain. The idea was that Protestant England would treat the natives justly and bring them genuine Christianity, while also expanding the English dominions. And they believed that through God's blessing, evangelism, material prosperity, and English expansion would march hand in hand. And they didn't see these as competing interests. They didn't separate religion out from the rest of life. They saw religion and politics and economics and all these things going together. The first successful English settlement was at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. Although Jamestown is often characterized as a non-religious colony, this is not at all accurate. It was religious and had explicitly Christian motives from the very beginning. There's also a widespread misconception I've mentioned before that the English came to America with racist views of Native Americans, rooted in ideas like polygenesis, the idea that humans have different ancestral beginnings, as well as the myth of Ham, taken from Scripture. But this isn't accurate. The English viewed Native Americans as human beings made in the image of God, and they tried to convert them to Christianity. They even believed that Indians were basically had the same skin color as Europeans. They were just darker because of the sun or because of greases or things or paints that they put on their bodies. The English were more likely to have racial views of Africans or people with black skin, but they hadn't applied that to Native Americans. In fact, they naively envisioned Indians converting to Christianity relatively quickly and forming a harmonious community with the English. This, though, is not what happened. Although there were initial signs of success, famously, this young Indian woman, Pocahontas, married the Englishman John Rolfe, which shows early on there was even a sense that English and Indians could freely intermarry and become one Christian people. But this was a faint hope at the beginning. And when the Indians did not end up becoming Christians in as great of numbers, unlike Pocahontas, who became a Christian and ended up changing her name to Rebecca and going to England, where she died, most Indians did not respond in these ways. And when the Indians resisted Christianity, English attitudes toward them hardened. This became all the more the case when the Indians fought back and resisted aspects of colonization, as in 1609. And in 1622, the Powhatan Indians, which Pocahontas was part of, launched a bloody uprising against the English in Virginia, killing hundreds of colonists. And Indian resistance toward colonization then became an excuse for English conquest. And at this point, the goal of an Anglo-Indian Commonwealth was abandoned. Now, the type of colony that emerged in Virginia, followed by Carolina and later Georgia, was a plantation society organized around indentured servitude. So these are usually Europeans coming over, sometimes Africans, and becoming servants for a certain term. But then later there was a shift from indentured servitude toward lifelong and hereditary African slavery. The first Africans brought to Virginia were probably indentured servants, but over time, as whites clamored for freedom, they developed a racial rationale, a racist ideology, to justify treating African slaves differently. The idea that their race fitted them for slavery, which again, ultimately goes back to arguments from people like Aristotle, although he didn't apply it in racial terms. In these southern colonies, the Church of England was established, but there were no bishops in America, and there were few clergy. And this meant that, much as in the Spanish colonies, lay colonists had a lot of power. And churches uniquely came to be governed in the South by boards of laymen known as vestries. But lay people, again, similar to in the Spanish Empire, lay people did not share the same priorities as the clergy or as missionaries. Often lay people did not want their slaves evangelized or baptized because they feared that if their slaves were Christians, they would use their Christianity to claim freedom. Now, English law did not require freedom for Christians, but there was a general association between the idea that Christians shouldn't be enslaved. There was a sense that Christians ideally shouldn't be slaves, although they could be for a time. Thus, to clear the way for mission work, the government and church both declared that baptism did not require freedom. And the hope was that then the masters would be willing to have their slaves evangelized without fear of losing them. But even so, many masters distrusted these rulings and resisted the evangelization of their slaves. Increasingly, as in the Spanish Empire, they conflated race with Christianity, associating Christianity with whiteness and associating blackness with what one scholar has called hereditary heathenism. They argued that the African race would never really be properly Christian. Clergy and missionaries rejected this logic, but they didn't have much power compared to the plantation owners. During the 1670s, Bacon's Rebellion broke out in Virginia, and poor white colonists and indentured servants, allied with Africans, both slave and free, rebelled against the planter class. Ironically, in part because the planter class refused to defend them from hostile natives on the frontier. So you had this irony where, in a sense, these rich planters are allied with natives on the frontier, at least de facto allied, against poor whites and poor blacks. And it's an indication of what might have been a common alliance between poor whites and poor blacks. But from this point forward, after crushing the rebellion, the planting class had an interest in fostering white supremacy, in fostering racism in order to persuade poor whites to align themselves with the rich whites rather than with slaves or even free blacks. And so you can very clearly see by the 1670s an entrenching of racism and an establishment of white supremacy. And it's clearly designed to justify the power that elite white colonists had in the South. But I think it's important, again, to remind ourselves that they didn't come to America with this in mind. They didn't come to America thinking in these racial terms and attempting to implement them. They came with lofty visions. But as soon as Indians or blacks didn't conform to English expectations, and as soon as they found that their Christianization threatened their power and wealth, then they quickly turned to a racial logic. So that's the situation in the South. Puritan New England in the North was quite different. And as we move forward, I'll refer to different places, and you can see here the different colonies. Down here, this reddish area is Virginia, which is what I've largely been talking about up to this point, the first southern colony. The Puritan colonies are up here: Massachusetts Bay, this red one, Plymouth, this purple one, and then Connecticut, this green one. And Rhode Island was a little bit different, although it's also part of New England. Now, it's important to distinguish the Pilgrims, who many of us know from the story of the first Thanksgiving between the Pilgrims and the Indians. We have to distinguish the Pilgrims from the Puritans. They shared much in common. They had broadly similar theology. The difference was that the Pilgrims were separatists. They were a group of separatists who had fled England for the Netherlands, spent a few years there, and then with the threat of religious war breaking out in Europe and in a desire to preserve their English culture, they had then migrated over to America in 1620 and founded the colony of Plymouth. They famously made an alliance with local Wampanoag Indians that endured for 54 years. But I'm not going to spend much time talking about Plymouth per se, because Plymouth always remained small, and much larger and more consequential was Massachusetts, which was founded by Puritans. Massachusetts Bay was the original name of this colony, founded in 1629. Now, we've already talked a little bit about why so many Puritans came to America, and far more Puritans went to New England than English people went to any other colony in these early years. So why were they going? Well, first of all, as I mentioned before, the Puritans believed that God was judging Europe in the 30 Years' War and the other religious wars, and that soon he would be judging England. And so they wanted to escape before that judgment came. Secondly, they wanted to establish congregations that were free to preach, to administer the sacraments, and to exercise church discipline according to Scripture. Now remember, we're going back in time a bit, so this is before the English Civil War. And they're facing the anti-Puritan policies of King James and then King Charles. And so they want to go to America where they can have freedom to establish the kind of churches they desire or believe are biblical. Third, they wanted to establish a godly commonwealth. They wanted to stay within the English realm, the English dominion, but they hoped that they could have some autonomy within that and establish a commonwealth in which godly men would govern according to biblical principles. Fourth, they wanted to convert the Indians. The Massachusetts Bay Charter, given by the king, said that converting the natives to Christianity was the colony's primary purpose. Fifth, they wanted to extend the English realm, and they talked explicitly about this, that for all their complaints about King James and King Charles, they wanted to expand the English Empire. And finally, they wanted land and economic opportunity. England was notoriously overcrowded. Land was hard to come by. And in America, it seemed that there was so much land free for the taking. Now, there was a sense in many European countries that Christian societies were sort of like modern-day Israel. Spain saw itself as God's new Israel. England did. We've seen that Transylvania did as well. People in the Netherlands saw themselves this way. And this was common in New England as well among the Puritans. They knew they were not chosen by God in the way that Old Testament Israel was. They knew they weren't in the same relationship as Old Testament Israel, but they did believe they were God's people and that they were supposed to be a religious society with religious laws. And so it made sense for them to use the story of Israel and even the laws given to Israel to make sense of their own experiences. One of their earliest and certainly their most important political leader was John Winthrop, a very devout man. And Winthrop argued that the Puritans were in a covenant with God, much like Israel in Deuteronomy. And he articulated this in what became his famous model of Christian charity speech. If they obeyed God, Winthrop argued, God would bless them. And if they disobeyed, God would punish them, just like with Israel of old. And Winthrop was one of the ones who famously described New England as a city on a hill, on whom all the eyes of the world would be. But he didn't see New England in this sort of hopeful sense. He didn't think New England was this pioneering place of the future that everyone would want to imitate. His goal in using the city on a hill metaphor was more to warn the people that if they were not faithful to the covenant, all the eyes of the world would see their infidelity. Winthrop and other Puritans didn't think America was the wave of the future. They saw themselves as going into the wilderness. They saw themselves as exiles. They still very much viewed England as the best hope of the future. Now, unlike in England, the Puritans in America were able to establish self-governing churches, free from the oversight of the English government and free from the oversight of English bishops. Interestingly, though, the system they established was not Presbyterian. Rather, it was congregational or independent. They did have sort of loose synods, but these synodical decisions were non-binding. It was a very decentralized system. The Puritans in America also rejected the idea of birthright church membership. Just because a person was baptized, they argued, didn't mean they had the right to participate in the Lord's Supper. And so they argued that for a person to be a full member of a church, baptism wasn't enough. A person had to give a credible profession of faith in which he or she described God's transformative working in their life by the Holy Spirit. And this became a key distinctive of Puritan New England. It was a high bar of membership. And there were many people who regularly and faithfully attended church all their lives and never made this sort of profession of faith. And so you had this kind of two-tiered membership emerge of baptized only members and then members who were baptized and had professed their faith and took the Lord's Supper. The Puritans also pioneered a new approach to government. And here again you see the blending between theological ideas and political ideas that was associated with the Reformed tradition. New England, in fact, quickly became the most democratic society in the world at that time. In England, only men who owned a lot of land could vote, and that was just a tiny number of people. But in New England, the Puritans separated voting from property ownership and instead established it to church membership. Now, many people have identified that as a theocratic move, because now you have to be a professing Christian to vote. But its actual effect was to dramatically expand the franchise, because far more people were members of churches than owned property. In addition, in New England, towns were governed somewhat democratically, where the vast majority of the men could speak into and vote on key decisions. And land was divided fairly, though not exactly equally, fairly equitably. These towns had a strong communal sense that they were obligated to live together as the body of Christ, both in the way they conducted themselves as churches and as towns. Massachusetts also developed a bicameral elected government, which means two different houses of government. They had a House of Magistrates, sort of an executive branch, and then they had a House of Deputies, which consisted of representatives from each town. And elected officials had to be church members. but they could not be pastors. And that was part of the Puritan Two Kingdoms doctrine of making sure that although the state was still religious, church and state were separated. And so the government of Massachusetts always consulted the clergy on major policy decisions and major laws. And the clergy did not insist that the law had to follow the Old Testament exactly, but they did argue that it should adhere to natural law and scripture. They also held traditional views of government's responsibility toward religion. Those who publicly rejected Puritan theology were banished, such as the woman Anne Hutchinson and her followers. And many of those who were banished ended up going to a new colony, Rhode Island, which is why Rhode Island's part of New England, but it wasn't Puritan right here. The most significant figure who was banished was Roger Williams, and he was the founder of Rhode Island. Rhode Island, thanks to Roger Williams's influence, Williams was a Puritan minister who ended up becoming convinced that the Puritans should not remain part of the Church of England, but should separate. So even all these congregational churches the Puritans were establishing in New England were still technically part of the Church of England. But the separatists were not. They had pulled out. And Williams was a separatist. He also ended up becoming a Baptist. And in Rhode Island, he insisted on religious toleration, and so Rhode Island always had the separation of church and state. And in that case, in that sense, Roger Williams was a pioneer, both for arguments of religious liberty and the separation of church and state. In fact, Williams even went to England and argued passionately for religious toleration to members who were meeting in the Westminster Assembly at the time. And what's interesting too about Williams is, unlike many who argued for toleration on pragmatic grounds, just to stop people from killing each other or for the sake of economic prosperity, Williams worked out sophisticated theological arguments to justify religious liberty. He argued that there is no parallel between Israel and modern societies, and that there should be no connection between church and state. And for that reason, he argued that the Church of Christ, the followers of Jesus, should be completely voluntary societies. However, Williams became more radical than that. He came to believe that there was no such thing as a true church anymore. And he argued that people shouldn't try to establish churches until Jesus sent a new wave of apostles. And so Williams ended up separating from all churches. He also became a Baptist. Williams also advocated on behalf of Native Americans, criticizing the notion that England could claim American land by right of the doctrine of discovery, and often criticizing Puritan militancy and covetousness toward the Indians. That was one of the reasons, ultimately, why he was banished, because he undermined the king's authority to authorize Massachusetts as a colony. Later on, Quakers came to Massachusetts, and they too were banished, but Quakers often refused to submit to their banishments because they were more than willing to defy the state. And so while in England, hundreds and even thousands of Quakers were imprisoned and being persecuted there, they were also persecuted in Massachusetts, where they were whipped and mutilated, and when some refused to stay away, 4 were even executed on Boston Common. After the Restoration, however, you might recall I said that after the Restoration in England, when Charles came back to the throne, they stopped executing people for religious reasons. And the same thing happened in New England. Now, how did the Puritans view Native Americans? Well, as I've said, they didn't come to America with racist views of the Indians, though they did have their prejudices. They believed that Indians, like all non-Christians, were ruled by the devil and needed to be liberated. And they thought that they were coming as liberators, that they would bring the benevolent forces of colonization, that the Indians would welcome them with open arms and embrace Christianity when they saw the English moral and religious superiority. In fact, this was the seal of Massachusetts. And here you can see an Indian standing with his bow and arrow, and the words coming out of his mouth are, "Come over and help us." And these words are taken from Acts, where Paul had a vision and a Macedonian appeared to him saying, "Come over and help us, come preach us the gospel." And this is how the Puritans saw themselves, as sort of answering this implicit plea coming from Native Americans. It's also important to talk about how the Puritans viewed native land. Despite Roger Williams's critique, and despite whatever the King of England might have said, the Puritans did not base their land claims solely on the doctrine of discovery, the idea that whatever Christian king discovered pagan lands was entitled to claim those lands. That's not how they argued. Rather, they argued that God has given the earth to all people in common and has commanded people to fill the earth and subdue it. Genesis 1, Genesis 9. And within that context, they said, exploration gives Christian nations the right to claim unused land. Now, disease had wiped out many Indians along the coast. As many as 90% of the Indian population had been wiped out along the coast. So the land was considered vacant and empty, and according to the Old English doctrine of vacuum domicilium, it was legitimate for anyone to occupy unused land. Still, the Puritans recognized that Indians had natural and legal rights, not over all of America, not over the parts they weren't using, but over the areas in which they lived, and the areas that they had developed through farming or that they used for fishing, although not the woods that they used for hunting. And so these lands that the Indians were actively using, the English said, these lands we have to purchase or secure by some sort of treaty. So they didn't believe they could just steal or conquer land. They did believe they had to purchase it. They also, the government of Massachusetts said that not just anybody could do this, but the government had to oversee all purchases. The problem is, Indians and English understood the sales differently. Indians assumed that when there was a transaction about land, the English would come and live on that land, but alongside the Indians, and together they would use it in future years. The English would then build their towns and farms, while natives would live in nearby towns and continuing to live and hunt and fish as they always had. And often these deeds actually explicitly granted Indians these rights. And it worked for a while, but the Indians couldn't have grasped just how many English were coming, and how this would make their way of life impossible. The more English that lived in a certain area, it no longer became possible for the Indians to hunt and fish and live as they always had, and they were gradually crowded out, and what had once been shared use tracts of land increasingly became only English tracts of land. English cattle, which were not native to America, cows, pigs, and horses are all alien to America, they overran native fields, and they consumed native crops. Enormous economic pressure led Indians to sell nearly all their lands, and for very low prices. And although in the short term this often seemed to benefit the Indians, in the long term it hurt them dramatically. And then, in the meantime, the English regularly pressured the Indians into signing treaties that subjected them in various ways to English rule, usually in exchange for protection. Now, the first Great War between Puritans and Indians arose out of tensions related to English expansion into the Connecticut Valley. And just jumping forward a little bit here for this map, this river here is the Connecticut Valley. Boston, where Massachusetts began, is over here. And so as English are settling in the Connecticut Valley, there was increasing violence. And when some Pequots, the Pequots lived down in this area, when some Pequots killed several Englishmen, Massachusetts demanded justice. The Pequots refused to surrender the perpetrators, so Massachusetts launched a raid against Pequot territory. The Pequots retaliated, and the war gradually escalated. and several major native groups allied with the English to try to bring the Pequots to heel. So again, the Pequots are a tribe living down here, and increasingly they're turning against, or the English are turning against them. Now, Indian warfare up to this point had typically been much more limited than European warfare. And it was the Puritans who brought the total warfare methods that were being used in places like Ireland and in the Netherlands and in the 30 Years' War, and they brought these methods to their wars with the Indians in America. They launched a surprise attack on a major Pequot fortified town, the town of Mystic, which is down in this area here. And they massacred hundreds of men, women, and children. They surrounded it, they set it on fire, and as Indians tried to flee, they cut them down. Then they conquered all the Pequot lands, enslaving hundreds of women and children, some of whom they sold into the Atlantic slave trade. They banned the Pequot nation and its identity in the Treaty of Hartford, negotiated in 1638. And this image was made at the time of the Pequot War in the first history of it. And here you can see the palisade of the fort of the Indian town of Mystic. These little huts are the Indian wigwams. And the first row of men surrounding the town are English soldiers from Massachusetts and Connecticut. And the second row surrounding are the native allies of the English, mostly Narragansetts and Neantics and Mohegans. And by the way, it's a good indicator that what was always true in all the Indian wars in America, it was never whites against Indians, plain and simple. The whites were usually unified, but the Indians were always divided, and there were always large numbers of Indians who fought on the side of the English or on the side later of the Americans against other Indians. The Indians were never unified. Now, it was a brutal war, but Puritan leaders justified it theologically. They viewed it as a defensive war. As soon as the Pequots launched their first attack and killed the English colonists, the Puritans argued that it was essential to defend the kingdom of Christ in America from the heathen, who they viewed as servants of the devil. And so when they slaughtered the Pequots at Mystic, they proclaimed that it was God who was fighting for them. And they justified their severity by appeal to the Old Testament and by common practices in European warfare. So the Pequot War is a tremendous tragedy that took place about 17 years after Plymouth was founded and about 8 years after Massachusetts was founded. Now, all this time, no serious missionary effort had been established in New England, and it wasn't until the 1640s that the Puritan minister John Eliot, who's now known as the Apostle to the Indians, began evangelizing Indians in Massachusetts. Eliot, like other Puritans, wanted to lead the Indians into genuine Christianity, not the superficial kind of Christianity he associated with Catholic missions. He believed the Indians had to be civilized first and made to live in accord with English ways before they could be evangelized and form their own churches. So unlike the Catholic missionaries who would rapidly baptize hundreds or thousands of Indians, Eliot was focused on a very slow teaching process. And it could only begin, in his mind, if Indians formally submitted to Massachusetts' authority and accepted Christian laws and even English laws. And this only began in the 1640s after the Pequot War. Eliot started preaching to Indians in 1646, and in 1650 he brought a group of them together in what was the first Puritan praying town, the town of Natick. And a praying town was where a group of Indians would come together and agree to receive English, to submit to English laws and to receive Christian teaching. From this point forward, the mission gradually expanded. Indians who were willing to submit to Massachusetts and receive religious instruction would receive a land grant from the colony. And their land would then become more secure than Indians who were not praying Indians. Praying Indians was the name that was given to those who came to live at these praying towns. So England Massachusetts was basically saying, if you agree to accept our laws and Christian teaching, we will give you a grant of land that no colonists can take away from you. And then they established laws requiring the Indians to adopt Christian and English ways. Many of these laws were moral, requiring obedience to the Ten Commandments, but others were cultural, such as requiring men to keep their hair short, or women to keep their hair tied up and to cover their breasts, and men to take up farming, which in Algonquin culture was considered part of women's sphere. The Indians did maintain local autonomy at these praying towns, but they were subject to the overall English jurisdiction. Now, because of Puritan strict standards for what it meant to be a Christian, it took a long time to establish a church. They held Indians to the same high membership bar as English people. The Indians had to show that they understood the Christian faith and that they could testify to God's working in their life. So it wasn't until 1660, a full 14 years after Eliot started preaching to them, that the Indians were able to establish their first congregation with native pastors. From this point forward, however, it was increasingly Indians who took up missionary work, Indians who took up the roles of pastors and teachers, and Eliot focused on training young Indian men in order to do this. Natick became a virtual seminary. And the mission expanded rapidly during the 60s and 70s, again, mostly driven by Indians, until in Massachusetts alone there were 14 praying towns, more if you add Plymouth and Connecticut. There were 5 native churches in all of New England, and several thousand praying Indians. And the map that I had showed you earlier, this focuses largely on Massachusetts, but every red name that you see is a praying town. And then there were more praying towns established in Plymouth Colony. There's a couple of these actually shouldn't be marked as praying towns. The map isn't exactly accurate, but it gives you a general idea of just the number and the density of these praying towns. And then just keep in mind that there were more here in Plymouth. Now, during the 1660s, while this was happening, many Puritan ministers were beginning to sense that their godly society was in decline. And part of the discouragement came from the fact that by this point, the Puritan attempt to establish a Puritan commonwealth in England had failed. The king had been restored, the Puritan cause there was doomed, and so it was natural that Puritan ministers would be discouraged about the situation in New England as well. They worried about worldliness, about people's obsession with land and economic prosperity, materialism. They worried about conflict that was tearing apart churches. They worried about people's resistance to the authority of their pastors and magistrates. And they worried that too few of the young people were becoming full church members. And these young people were then getting married and having kids, and their kids couldn't even be baptized. So there was this sense that New England had slid away from the initial religious vibrancy and vigor that had characterized the first wave of Puritans. So the clergy, to resolve some of these problems, advocated what was later described as the halfway covenant. That was a derogatory term. But the idea was that baptized members who had not professed their faith and become full members could nevertheless bring their own children for baptism, as long as they affirmed the church's teaching and submitted to its covenant. What this meant was that the two-tiered membership track of those who profess their faith and those who are only baptized members can endure into a third generation. Now, this proved very controversial and divisive. Some people consider this a compromise that would lead New England ultimately into apostasy. But others considered it an essential way of the church serving the rising generation and making sure that the youth remained within the church. But it was divisive and it divided churches. And in the background, ministers were constantly warning of God's judgment, claiming that the people had broken their covenant with God. And that, as they put it, God had a controversy with New England. One young pastor, Increase Mather, warned of a cataclysmic judgment in the form of war in 1674. And it just so happened that a year later, the bloodiest war per capita in American history broke out. That was King Philip's War, fought from 1675 to 1676. The war arose out of the tensions that came from massive English expansion. New England's population had mushroomed to many tens of thousands, putting enormous pressure on native lands and on the native way of life. Some of the Indian leaders, known as sachems, were alienated by the fact that when their people became Christians, they stopped obeying them and submitted to English jurisdiction. They resented the fact that colonial authority expanded along with the mission. But what actually triggered the war was the murder of an Indian minister, a praying Indian, in Plymouth Colony. Now, in Plymouth Colony, there were thousands of praying Indians, and the native Wampanoags were divided between probably a majority by this point that were praying Indians and a minority that had steadfastly refused to become praying Indians. And Plymouth put some of these non-praying Indians on trial for murdering this praying Indian minister, even though many Indians believed they were innocent. The non-praying Indians, led by Philip, King Philip, as the English called him, retaliated by raiding English homes after the English executed these men for the murder. And Philip was also concerned that the English were going to come after him next. So his warriors raided English homes. Settlers retaliated by killing a Wampanoag, and the Wampanoags in turn killed several colonists. And the war flared up from there. Now, it might have remained a small war between Plymouth and this local group of Wampanoags, but the reality was that other natives throughout New England shared the Wampanoags' grievances. To make matters worse, the English made heavy-handed attempts to force Indians to prove their loyalty by surrendering their weapons or by providing hostages. And this drove some groups that would have tried to remain neutral and were trying to remain neutral into the arms of the enemy, including some Christian Indians. Most Christian Indians ended up remaining loyal to the English, and so did some non-Christian Indians. But a few Christian Indians also fought on the enemy side. The largest native tribe, the Narragansetts, was here in Rhode Island, and it tried to remain neutral, but the English suspected that it was duplicitous and decided to launch a massive preemptive strike. They attacked a large Narragansett fortified town, and in a big battle, hundreds of native men, women, and children were killed, although a good number of English soldiers died as well. And this blew the war wide open, because now the Narragansetts were definitely on the enemy side. Algonquins launched massive attacks, destroying a large number of frontier settlements and threatening to wipe out New England. And it really was true that for a while many Puritans thought that New England was going to be completely wiped out. To many English, all Indians were suspect, even though most of the Christian Indians had remained loyal to the English. And so there began to be a growing number of cases of vigilante violence against Indians. And it's here in New England that you really see racism start to emerge, the idea that no Indian can be trusted. And so the English began to round up Christian Indians and to intern them on Deer Island and other islands here in Boston Harbor in the dead of winter, under bitter and miserable conditions and in places where there wasn't much decent food. Missionaries like John Eliot and his ally among the magistrates, Daniel Gookin, who was the superintendent of the mission, protested these activities. And Gookin even received threats, death threats, and possibly one assassination attempt because of his attempts to defend the Christian Indians and secure justice for them. And after the war, he wrote a book on their sufferings. But despite this mistreatment at the hands of the English, most Christian Indians still maintained their loyalty and their faith. And in fact, when the tide of the war finally turned, it was largely because the English finally began to use Christian Indians as soldiers and as scouts. and Christian Indians fighting alongside English colonists finally helped to defeat the enemy. But as the tide turned, it became a war of conquest and enslavement on a scale far larger than that of the Pequot War. Thousands of natives died, and hundreds were sold into the Atlantic slave trade. And again, John Eliot criticized this. He argued that to sell Indians into slavery was worse than to kill them because you were banishing them from any chance at hearing the gospel. And he appealed to the gospel as informing the English what they should be trying to accomplish for Indians, that they should be showing them mercy and compassion and seeking the salvation of their souls. But Eliot's petition against selling them into slavery had no effect. When the war ended, the Indians who remained in New England, much smaller number than had been there before, were essentially confined to what became reservations. They gradually lost most of their land in the coming years, and the number of praying towns was reduced dramatically. A few survived and flourished, and over time, many more Indians would actually become Christians. But the early vision of English and Indians living side by side in a harmonious community with any sort of measure of equality, similarly as had happened in Virginia, fell away. And from this point forward, there's a measurable and distinct sense of white supremacy that emerged, that from this point forward, Indians, even Christian Indians, were second-class citizens who were kept separate. Now, as in the Pequot War, the Puritans viewed King Philip's War as a defense of the kingdom of Christ, as a war against the heathen. They viewed it as God's judgment on Puritan New England, but not because of their sins against Indians, usually because of other sorts of sins. And so when their armies started to win victories again, and they believed that was because they had repented, then they believed that God was fighting for them, and that God was leading them to triumph over the heathen, and that God was judging the heathen through them. And it's notable that the early histories of the war were all written by ministers, and they're all written in very theological terms. They described the war as a war of the Lord. And actually, that's the title of my book on Puritan New England, The Wars of the Lord, because they viewed their missionary work as a sort of spiritual warfare, as in Scripture, when it uses that metaphor to describe the conquest of souls from Satan. But the tragedy of what happened was a literal warfare, which they also understood as a war of the Lord, in which God's Christian people were conquering the heathen to ensure the defense and survival of the kingdom of Christ in New England.